Now we will go to our next session, Disintermediation and Disrupting the Market, a how-to guide. For this, I am pleased to introduce our colleagues, Dr. Richard Sandor, an entrepreneur and economist who invents new markets. He is currently the chairman and CEO of the American Financial Exchange, which was established in 2015. AFX is an electronic exchange for direct interbank and financial institution lending and borrowing. The AFX flagship product, the Ameribor Benchmark Index, reflects the actual borrowing costs of thousands of regional, mid-sized, and community banks across the United States. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and from the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, he holds an honorary degree of science, honoris causa, from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH. Joining the two of us today is our other colleague, Mr. Dennis Chookaszian. Mr. Chookaszian was with CNA Insurance for over 26 years, serving as chairman and CEO for 7 years, then chairman of the executive committee for 3. Prior to that, he was president for 2 years and CFO for 15 years. Following his efforts at CNA, he became chairman and CEO of Empower Incorporated, an internet financial advisory service. Mr. Chookaszian, like myself, is a CPA and was chairman of the Financial Accounting Standards Advisory Council, which provides guidance to the U.S. FASB on accounting matters from 2007 to 2012. He has served as a director on the boards of 13 publicly traded corporations and 50 private corporations. He is currently a director of 3 public companies and 20 private corporations. He also serves as an arbiter and expert witness. Mr. Chookaszian is an adjunct professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and teaches corporate governance courses. He also teaches international corporate governance at Shanghai University in China, Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance in China, and at the IIPM in India. Mr. Chookaszian has a BS degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern University, an MBA from the University of Chicago, and an MS degree in economics from the London School of Economics. He is a U.S. CPA, a chartered global management accountant, a chartered property casualty underwriter, and a certified management accountant. In 2010, Mr. Chookaszian received the Outstanding Director Award from the Financial Times Outstanding Directors Exchange. So no one could ever accuse any of you for being not active enough or not involved. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you both here today.
Thank you, Gabby. You know, it's when you're a little older, as Richard and I are, a problem that you have is that your resumes go on forever. Thank you.
No, but it's exceptional, just impressive, and it's really, I'm extremely honored and excited to be able to moderate this session and to really draw upon the depth and breadth of knowledge of both of you gentlemen, so thank you. To guide the course of our conversation today, I've just outlined a few questions, but these are gentle introductions and should be taken as just a gentle path upon which our informal conversation can be guided. You know, you've both had exceptional careers and contributed so much to innovation, progress, and success in the global financial sector and capital market. This session talks about disruption and disintermediation. Before we delve into this, if you can share a bit about what you believe defines those two terms and, you know, how do you know it? Is it something that you know it when you see it? Or how are they similar or dissimilar? If you could explain and give your personal thoughts on those two concepts. Dennis?
Sure, I'd be happy to comment, Gabby. And first, Richard and I have worked together for about 30 years or so. We've known each other for a long time on a number of projects that were, in fact, disruptive and innovative. And so we come from a slightly different perspective, mine initially from more of an insurance perspective, and Richard, of course, from a financial perspective, given his long tenure at the Chicago Board of Trade. And so when you look at industries, I think one of the key things to think about is that disruption takes place at a very different pace in different industries. So I would argue that in the insurance industry, disruption has been relatively slow. Disintermediation has been relatively slow. the products today aren't radically different than the products that you saw in place 50 years ago. You're still insuring more or less the same thing. Not that there isn't innovation, there certainly is. Certain specialty products, as you got into some of the financial insurance, that has changed. But the pace of innovation is much, much slower than the pace of innovation that you've seen in financial markets with the creations of interest rate futures and the securitization of almost anything, and now, of course, with blockchain and what's going on there. Now, some of those elements will also be useful in the insurance industry. So if you look at what's happening to the way the insurance industry functions, the blockchain technology is going to be something that will be able to be used widely for information control, distribution, for a series of things, and then it will come. But to the core of your question was also the issue about how do you know it when there's disintermediation, or what do you do? And the best way to understand that is to look back historically. And when you think about companies that didn't recognize that fact, they got disintermediated and were blown away. So a great example of that would be Eastman Kodak. Eastman Kodak, back 40 years ago, developed all of the patents on digital cameras. They had it all, but they decided that if they were to implement those cameras, they would cannibalize their film business, and they decided not to do it. And as a consequence, it happened by other people doing that, and they were essentially put out of business by other people not doing that. Same thing happened to Encyclopedia Britannica. For failure to go electronic, they were disintermediated by Microsoft and Encarta. So I think the issue is that you have to be constantly looking over the horizon. And so what's the way that you do that? What's been written about by Taleb, for example, in Black Swan, and when you look at the kinds of things that have occurred. And so the key issue for any company or any organization is to be able to look over the horizon and do the Wayne Gretzky thing, which says you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where the puck is going to be. And if you do that, you can prevent the problems. And so, Richard, I think you probably have a lot of perspectives on that. Oh, and Richard, I think you're muted.
Dennis, first of all, Gabby, thank you for the kind introduction. It's always great to be with my friend Dennis, and I want to kind of give you a bit of an overview of financial inventive activity and use that brief lesson in history to bring out the points about disruption and, disintermediation. Hold on.
I think you might be muted. Okay.
Okay. So let's take a look at 4 or 5 innovations in history. So I'll start with the Dutch East India Company, which was the first limited liability corporation. Then I'll go to wheat trading in Chicago in 1848. Then I'll go to Ginnie Mae's and interest rate futures and treasury futures in the mid-70s. And then I'll go to environmental products like market-based solution to acid rain and global warming. So what do these, and then also to complement what Dennis said, insurance.
Yeah.
And let me start with the Dutch East India Company. Well, there's a structural change, and there's a theory or a hypothesis that we have 7 stages. The first stage is a structural change that occurs over a long period of time, or an exogenous event which causes a major change. Mm-hmm. In the case of the Dutch East India Company, it was, in fact, the need to finance trade with India and then ultimately with America and the opening up. So we had a invention of a financial instrument, a limited liability corporation, and it proceeded to go through these 7 stages. The first is a structural change. The second is standardization. The third is creating evidences of ownership, because we don't trade commodity securities or fixed income. We trade evidences of ownership. The fourth thing is for informal trade to go on in the evidences of ownership. The fifth is the starting of spot markets or securities or commodities. The sixth is derivatives, and then the seventh is the standardized, and then you deconstruct those derivatives. So it doesn't matter. In the case of wheat trading, it was the need to populate or feed the populations that grew up in the East Coast. And grading had to be, you had to say how much infestation, how much protein, what kinds of things. Then there was an invention of elevator receipts, grain receipts. Then those began traded. Then there were forward trades in them. Then there were futures. Then there were export contracts that were tailored in different ones. So in that case, it was 1848 to 1865 between spot and futures, Gabby. I've been involved in 5 of these innovations. They haven't been the Dutch East India Company. I'll come to my career as a primary inventor. So the big change that occurred for the development of mortgage-backed securities and financial futures was the fact that the population growth was in the West. Yeah. In the 1960s, the money was in the East Coast savings banks. You couldn't trade, as people did, efficiently to buy and sell individual loans. They did it, but it was terrible. They'd all go to Arizona in February in the warm weather, and they trade the mortgages one by one, and that wasn't a very efficient way to do it. And so Ginnie Mae came along. I tried unsuccessfly to grade mortgages, and Dennis had ended up in a University of Chicago journal on trying to homogenize and get a uniform grade for mortgages. But Ginnie Mae's, the government put a wrap around individual FHA and BA, so you had trading of mortgages, ultimately the invention of Ginnie Mae, which gave you standards, which created evidences of ownership. That evolved into a forward market, ultimately futures, which required a law because you had to redefine what a commodity was and move it from the U.S. Department of Agriculture into a federal regulatory exchange that defined a commodity as anything tangible or intangible. That little word change in a bill in 74 created modern futures. They would never have existed without that. We go back then, and let's take a look at insurance and weather and acid rain. Yeah. They came around 1990. We had breathing problems like China does. The cities look gray. In this case, the government created the commodity. It was a right to emit, and it only gave out a limited number of those, and those became traded, and thus that evolved into market-based solutions for global warming. The parallel in the last one, on the weather side, was what Dennis spoke about. Again, a 30-year arc. I taught at, I'm 700 years old, Gabby.
No.
I taught at Berkeley in the 60s, and there was a quake in LA in 1966, and it got everybody spooked, so I wrote an academic article in the British Journal of Finance advocating futures or derivatives on insurance.
Yeah.
And passed by 20 years, and the Board of Trade was looking at home and life. I returned to my friend Dennis, who said, "You're barking up the wrong tree." The real need is at the catastrophic end. That's where risk transfer should occur.
Yeah.
The message was you can not only have academic input, but you need practitioners, people like Dennis who have core competency.
Sure.
Recognize. So all the data doesn't work. So what am I saying is we have 4, 5, 6 examples, half of which I've been involved with. They have an epochal event, an epic change. It's visible. Okay, and you can see it, but you have to think in long terms. That may take 10, 20, 30 years to unfold. To just put a bow on it now, it's totally obvious that the epic event is COVID-19. And that will change teleeducation, telemedicine. It will change blockchain, cryptocurrencies. It will, the whole notion of payment systems, delivering between remote sensing systems, blockchain, cryptocurrencies. We now have the event that will trip everything. It started in 1990 with Stuart Haber at Princeton writing a journal article on the blockchain. Then came Nakamoto. Now we're 30 years into it, and it's exactly on time to be a major change over the next 10 years. And that's why, Gabby, your hosting of this conference couldn't have had better timing.
Yeah, for sure. You know, that's just such a beautiful overview and a way of looking from an ecosystem standpoint of everything that's going on and the level of interconnectivity that we see today with digital assets and cryptocurrency. So thank you for giving us such a high-level economic macro view. You know, one of the things that, you know, we see especially, and that I am just grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about, is the role that your hand has played in helping to shape and steward some of these amazing inventive products and really groundbreaking technologies. For those of us who are today sitting as CEOs or presidents or the heads of different trading firms in the crypto and blockchain space, if you could share with us a little bit about, you know, how you stewarded the growth and evolution of the various elements of disruptive change and disintermediation that you've been involved with, and how, from your standpoint, you think that those lessons may be applied as we look to try and guide and shepherd the growth of this emerging industry.
I think, again, the timing of the conference is perfect. Let me preface the answer with what we saw yesterday because it fits the theme, and that was the breaking up of IBM. And how do we search for innovation? Where does it come? And the fact is, IBM, great company, but it didn't come up with the operating system for personal computers. Microsoft did. So it took a new player to disrupt, right, and to disintermediate, to recognize the personal computer, not the mainframe, was the door of the future. IBM owned the industry, dominated it, et cetera, but it should have owned Apple, but it didn't. It missed that.
Yeah, very much.
And then Apple missed Google, the search engine, and then Google missed Facebook. So every major innovation is generally missed by the dominant player in the space. So what I've looked to do in my particular use to look at things, whether it's a Maribor, a new benchmark to replace LIBOR, whether it's Treasury futures, you went to the intermediate and outsiders. The big institutions are never first movers.
Fair. Yeah, that's very true.
And there are 4 stages, and Dennis and I have talked about this, that you have first movers, fast followers, slow followers, and then I'd rather die than change.
Okay. So we don't be part of the last group then.
So we don't want to be part of the last group. So first, the first movers. So the first movers, will tend to be people who have no legacy, vested interests, who have no ties to do it, right? They don't, the big wirehouses didn't invent E-Trade or Schwab or anything like that. They made too much money as commission brokers, and they weren't going to be. So you find the intermediate players, okay, and not the big ones. Then you can sometimes identify the fast followers, and they might be big players. So it might be a Goldman, it might be somebody like that who's not likely to be a first mover, but a fast follower. And then you go to slow followers. There's 4 things in this cube that we talked about with facets, and you've got to make sure, because the disruption generally has 4 facets to it. It's a complex web of legislation, regulation, building institutions, and then designing specific contracts. And that requires a complex web of politics, sociology, psychology, educating accountants, educating lawyers, educating academics, educating the press. So you have a very complex ecosystem of players that have to do it. And in the case of financial futures, it was to, A, recognize that there was a structural change, and that was interest rates would become volatile. B, go to Washington, work with senators, and develop and write an act that would facilitate the birth of it. Okay, so that was critical. Then it was 3, to call in firms like Arthur Andersen today, which is now Accenture, to write books on accounting and hedge accounting and what it was. And then you had to educate people as to what a clearing corporation was and who were the big traders, and then you had to go before trade associations, educate them. You had to go to journalists and hold press conferences. So it's shepherding, identifying players, and it's like a new product recognized. And I'll conclude with this, Gabby, because you gotta plant the seed. Then you gotta water. Then you have to water the garden. Then you have to grow the tomatoes. Then you have to harvest the tomatoes. Then you have to take the tomatoes off the tree and wash them and off the vines. And then you have to chop them up, and then you have to cook them. Then you have to put them on a plate. Then you have to take a spoon and put it in the hand of the user and help them to lift the food to their mouth. And then you have to help them chew it.
They're very involved.
And so what I'm saying is that the lesson of that is markets don't automatically start, okay?
Yeah, for sure.
They require nurturing, a lot of things, and the fundamental premise in every economic textbook reads, assume there's a market for widgets. That assumes away everything Dennis and I have done for the last 20 years.
Yeah, for sure. And Dennis, I'd like to throw it to you as well. You know, we have a number of viewers today from the insurance industry. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, what your experience has been, especially in shepherding and guiding the development of different products and services and helping to contribute to the growth and success of CNA Insurance globally? You know, how do you view, especially this concept of like a whole systems view for helping to promote and engender disruption and disintermediation? Dennis?
Sure, yeah. And I think as Richard talked about, he talked about how product evolution was so much a part of what was going on in the financial industry. But over in the insurance industry, the innovation and the change wasn't really so much about the product. It remained fundamentally the same, but what it was about was the way in which insurance was distributed and managed. And if you go back 50 years ago, the two core competencies that drove the insurance industry were, one, access to capital, and second, access to information. So if you go back to 1960, for example, both were very difficult. Capital wasn't readily available, and it was not easy to get information. There were no computers, and so who had all that information? The large insurance companies. As the industry has evolved, innovation has taken place. Today, capital is readily available, so that's no longer a core competency. Anybody can get the capital. And then second, information is...
Oh, we'll give him a second there. I'll go ahead and toss it back to you, Richard, to kind of talk a little bit, and maybe we can pick up on a similar vein, which is that, you know, now there seems to be a lot of excitement around ESG and sustainability, and you were really quite a visionary ahead of your time with a lot of the work that you did with the Chicago Climate Exchange and the development of green or sustainable finance. This is a particular area of interest that people have brought up, and I just wanted to kind of ask you if you could comment a little bit about this particular type and emergence of the concept of thinking holistically and about your environmental, social, governance impact, and how, you know, the private sector and financial markets can really drive change and development in this space.
Great. Let me kind of get to... Again, forgive me, Gabby, if it's boring. I'm sorry. No. I want to put it in context. So, stock index futures were born in the early 80s. They were facilitated by a change in the law which allowed futures to exist on securities. But they were also formed at a time of need. In the 1970s, the major fund managers all tanked. It was an incredible bear market, and there were only 4 or 6 of them. And my understanding is they got together in a room and they said, this is no good. We can't promise people they're going to make money in the stock market.
Yeah.
They said to each other, this is, maybe it's rumor, maybe it's not, but I understand. They said to each other, let's forget trying to make money. Let's just judge ourselves on benchmarks and see how we do relative to the market, because we can't beat the market.
Yeah.
We've got to develop a whole new set of criteria. So that created the commoditization of the equity markets. Now, my own particular, so watching go, a structural change, a bear market, no good, let's get stock indexing, let's get people motivated to do it. So in the late 90s, I got a call to join a Swiss mutual fund that was focusing on sustainability, and there were 4 or 5 people, and we raised $100 million, and we sat around and they said, how do you get this going? We are this, meaning sustainable investing. And because it was going to be a fund that invested in the best of class. Prior to the 1990s, it was a negative filter, no booze, no casinos.
Yeah.
It was all, it was a Calvinist type of approach to life. And we said, let's do something different. Let's do the best of breed. So even though cement companies are dirty, let's find the cleanest cement company.
Okay.
And then let's find the cleanest power company. You know, we'll ban military and we'll do some things that are obvious, like smoking and things like that. So we sat around and I said to the economists there, you're going to need a benchmark.
Yeah.
And why don't we go to 1,000 companies and ask them if they employ women versus men? Do they have people of color? Do they emit carbon or not emit carbon? What are the best practices? And that was the birth of a sustainability index, which we sold to Dow Jones in 2001. So again, we're 20 years into
Yeah, exactly.
the first index, which I played a small role in, was the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Now, in the last 3-4 years, as the public is waking up, that there is sustainability has to do with financial sustainability, environmental sustainability, and governance, you know, and there were 3 pillars of sustainability. And I think now we're getting ready for a major breakout. And there's alignment. So the alignment comes, are there enough women leading, in my case, in the banking sector? Where are they? Are there enough people of color? Do the people who engage and perform and hire women or have a multicultural, do they do better? The people who help minority communities, do they do better in the financial sector? Are there products? We've just launched a platform for minority loans. This social and COVID exacerbates. So you've got a 20-year period, and now you've got things that are in movement. And I think I've never been more bullish about sustainable investing. And there's a lot of greenwashing, but I had a conversation yesterday with Mark Carney, who is the former head of the Bank of England, and he's heading a project that is Standard Chartered, Shell Oil, major corporates around the world to talk about offsets like preservation of rainforests, of sustainability and wind and power. So this is really coming to forth. And if I'm a young person, how does that fit into all of this? Well, first of all, I can get a green supply chain because of the blockchain. If I'm Walmart, I can figure out that tagging and monitoring and drones along with the blockchain allow me to look at every single commodity from its source to its use to figure out what environmental degradation it is spilling off. So I think it's going to be an enormous ability, enormous economic incentives and profits to be had by marrying the environment, crypto, and the blockchain, that there's no greater way than you can monitor carbon. When I was working on the first carbon markets, you had to go fly over Brazil with radar.
For sure.
You couldn't even do it with satellites. Now you've got drones. So and so Costa Rica now can really map every single tree it has. It can basically determine the thing. So between that and the blockchain and crypto, the convergence of environmental, financial, and technology represents a great opportunity in ESG.
Amazing. Yeah. You know, there's been a proliferation now of products that are emerging, such as tokenizing green products and opportunities, and coins that have a focus or an emphasis on environmental, social governance, and sustainability. So already, you're right, there's been this interconnectivity between the development of the blockchain technology and digital asset space and the desire and need, demand-driven by emerging emerging millennial and Generation Z investors that are looking for products that better align with their worldview and mindset. So thank you. I'm going to push back to our colleague Dennis. We had left off on the developments and the stewardship and how you used your hand in shaping some of the emergence of disruption and disintermediation in the insurance industry. And so I'd like to just come back to you for a moment. If you can continue your line of thought. I apologize for the interruption, but please, Dennis.
Well, actually, this was all planned, and it was an example of disintermediation and interruption.
It was well done, my friend.
So, well played, right?
Well played.
Going back to the insurance industries, I mentioned, I'm not, just before I was cut off there, that the industry core competencies were access to capital, access to information. That has now shifted because access to capital and access to information is really basically easy and free. And the core competency now is control of the customer and process efficiency. So the competencies have shifted drastically, and it's really not about product innovation. There are some product innovations, but it's not about that. So what's happening now is it's shifted the power, particularly to distribution organizations who have become very, very good at control of the customer. You see the rise of the very successful large brokerage firms such as Aon, for example, Marsh, who have essentially become very, very successful by doing that. So that's a shift. The other element of it, though, when you start looking at what's happened with all of these changes that's taken place in cryptocurrencies, and it's the issue when I look back in the insurance industry also at some of the changes there, or in the financial industries that I've been involved in, you don't really know you're at this seminal event until afterwards. And I think Richard said something very, very important a little earlier, which was that COVID is really much more of a seminal event than I think anyone realizes. And as he pointed out, it's going to change everything. It's going to change our way of working. We're not going back into the office the way we were before. There'll be a very different office structure that has an impact on the real estate industry and downtown office spaces, for example. As that has occurred, as COVID has changed the communication between people and the way that's going to take place, that also will get magnified by the way that you will use technologies like blockchain. And so right now, if you were to say, what should people doing now? You should be sitting here today doing exactly what Richard was talking about in the 4 phases, and you don't be, I'm not changing no matter what, I'd rather die. You don't want to do that. So what you should be doing is looking at what you're doing now and saying, how are these changes going to impact me? And one of the issues that we'll talk about a little bit later in the session today is this issue about what is one of the biggest challenges we face. And you heard it from the Congressman Foster and Richard, and I'll say the same thing. It's all about safety, security, and trying to clean up the cash markets. Because whenever you see a new market develop, like the cryptocurrency market, bad people step in and do bad things. And we actually had a similar experience in the insurance industry where there was actually one product innovation that was somewhat interesting. And back in 1990, when you had the AIDS crisis, people had life insurance policies, and that as the individual with that life insurance policy had a limited life expectancy, a market developed to be able to sell that policy to someone who would give you cash today and then would collect the benefit of the policy when you died within a more or less a 2-year period of time. And that created what was called the Biotical settlements market, where essentially it was buying a policy from someone who didn't need it, life insurance policy, and then cashing it in. You give money and you cash it in when the person dies. And so you might be able to give somebody 50 or 60% of the face value of the policy up front. Because, present value of money, we all understand that, and that's what happened. Now, when that developed, what it did is it spawned many, many bad actors. And so at CNA, we saw that as an interesting idea, and we actually formed an insurance industry entity to actually do that, because it was actually, when you looked at the variance of that in comparison to what was going on with regard to our life product, there the 2 products worked in the opposite way. On the life insurance product, you wanted the person to live as long as they could. On the Biotical settlements, as short as they could. So we saw the need to clean it up. and we went after regulation. And to Richard's point, it took the better part of at least 5 years and more like 10 years before you could get the right regulation in place, getting things in place. And now there's a very vibrant market in life settlements. So that's exactly the kind of thing you see happening now. And so the key thing that is necessary is to try to get those controls and standards in place that can give people confidence that when they hold the product that they know they'll be able to get their money out and that it's a fairly traded market.
Gabby, can I compliment?
Of course, please, go ahead.
Both with an I and an E, what Dennis said. The compliment is because he said it so well. Ellen, the compliment with me is that if we take a look at these phases and stuff that we've done, and Dennis, I think, nailed it, and particularly about the kinds of regulations and the time to implement it. So whatever small success I've had in the last 50 years in this, I've always endeavored to get the right kind of regulation, right?
Of course, yeah.
And it's not regulation versus non-regulation. It's the optimum kind of regulation. The ones that Dennis said, you know, create security and safety and uniform standards. And unless the blockchain or the crypto market engages in a self-regulatory framework that precludes unnecessarily federal or state regulation, the growth will be hampered because regulation is a business, okay? Let me start with that. It's very important. If I could put out a clarion call and a warning to all of you inventors, okay? You invent products. There's people who invent businesses because of regulation. They become rent seekers. They control the staffs of regulatory agencies. We read about it now, whether it's securities or drugs or anything like that. There's the right kind of regulation, and we've managed to do that well. When we abandon it, we get a heavy hand, and you get what economists call rent seekers. Yeah. And you get the ability to make $5 or $10 million a year as a lobbyist, and that's a competitive to your business, okay? Because they will control it. So it's very important that I think the market participants in inventive activity and innovation think about the optimum kind of regulation that will serve the public safety, but yet facilitate economic growth.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I'm a big proponent as well of this concept of, balanced regulation that ensures that there's responsible innovation in the industry and it allows for technological evolution and development so that you do have economic prosperity, but at the same time that it ensures that there's a sufficient level of protection of both consumers as well as from an ESG standpoint, your broader stakeholders and the furtherance of public interest. So, I really thank you for that comment. Along those lines, I wanted to kind of, shift to Dennis and to talk a bit about, what we've talked about, this concept of balanced regulation. You had brought up the issue in the context of the insurance industry, but how do you see it evolving, and what role could it have in the blockchain and cryptocurrency and digital asset space?
Yeah. Well, first, I think that one of the key issues in the insurance industry, again, is the efficiency of process and the ability to access information. And that's where blockchain plays a very big role. And I think over time, many of the systems will gravitate to blockchain-style systems. The role of cryptocurrencies could ultimately be used as a payments mechanism and could actually be used for some interesting financing alternatives. But I think that's down the road a ways. I don't think that will happen right away. I think that's a little bit later in the development path. I think the more rapid development will be in seeing systems move in that direction. The other issue is the impact of how it affects the way you report things. And the congressman, for example, did talk about accounting standards and the question about IFRS versus U.S.-based standards. And it might be worthwhile to put a little bit of additional background on that. My background's pretty heavy in that area, and I chaired the U.S. Accounting Standards Board, FASAC, when Chris Cox was chairman of the SEC. And when he departed as chairman in 2008, he actually, as his last act in the last 2 months of his stay as chairman of the SEC, he had two things that he enacted. One was a move to create a different mechanism of reporting information and moving away from the old filing statements and to go to a mechanism which could then be used for reporting in a very different way. And that was a very important development. And then the other development that occurred was his movement to say that the U.S. should go to IFRS. So those are the two very important things that happened. And moving to IFRS, the international standard. And when he said that, I think most people said, gee, it makes sense. Shouldn't the U.S. be on the same standard system as the rest of the world? That sort of makes sense. You don't want to have different accounting standards. But what we did is we took that on as a committee and we worked with the FASB on that. And after about 2 years of study, what we concluded was that it wasn't possible for the U.S. at that time to move to IFRS. And I'd make the argument that today that the same things are true, because the information that's passed out about IFRS is frankly not correct. There are 200 countries, more or less, in the world. About 120 countries say they are on IFRS, but the number that are actually on IFRS is less than 10. Most of the countries around the world say, well, we're on IFRS, but we will enact the parts we like, and the parts we don't like, we'll do it a different way. So pure IFRS is very, very scanty in implementation. It's Canada, it's South Africa, there's a handful of countries, but there's very few that are actually on pure IFRS. So it would be impossible to say you're going to that, and what does that mean if you're going to change it? The other element of it, so why didn't it work for the IFRS? The reason is that when I chaired that committee, I said, well, let's compare the two. And so what I did is I had them take all of the pages of IFRS, all the pages of US GAAP, and when you added it up, there were, and put them in the same type font and all that, it was 4,500 pages of US GAAP and only 1,400 pages of IFRS, and that's the problem. The problem is with the heavily litigious system that we're in the US, those additional 3,000 pages, they're there to specify things and narrow the options. When you're in IFRS, you have a lot more optionality that you do than you do in US GAAP. US GAAP, it clarifies it for you much more specifically. And the US litigation system, in my opinion, will not sustain a system that has that much variability in the accounting standards because everybody does their own thing, because that's a real problem. So I believe that while that's being discussed again, I think it's misguided, and I don't think it will work. If the U.S. does go to that, we'll go to IFRS, which is with another 3,000 pages of our own standards added on top of it. So these regulations, as Richard pointed out, they have to be the right kind of regulations. And so a move to IFRS is not a good idea unless you maintained a lot of the specific standards we have. Same thing applies to the crypto standards.
Gabby, can I again just make a comment about what Dennis is saying and to reinforce that which goes to the idea of rent seeking. It's the right kind of regulations and laws, and as Dennis points out, it's also brevity. Okay, brevity is something. There's inflation in legislation. Okay, and if we take a look at the Waxman-Markey bill, the one on climate, to getting back to ESG, that bill, okay, was larger than the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Quran combined. Now, you can't write a piece of legislation to stop climate change, and you can govern the world's religions in fewer and more patients in a climate bill than you can in biblical wisdom. And something seems to be incorrect with that, I don't think.
Yeah. No, and it's funny. Dennis and I always respectfully disagree with the role of IFRS and global adoption and implementation. But I think, we can all agree that it may not be 100% applied to the letter of the law around the world, but as a, global set of principles-based standards, what IFRS has done, as with many other types of standards that have emerged, including in the area of sustainability reporting, it has helped to raise the bar globally regarding the quality of financial information, or in the case of sustainability reporting, non-financial information around the world to a degree that just didn't exist 20 years ago. For, small areas of discrepancy between the letter of the standards as admitted by the International Accounting Standards Board, the value of that, the ability to attract foreign direct investments, the opportunities to allow for there to be confidence in the financial reporting in jurisdictions around the world, it would not be possible if it weren't for the excellent work of the IASB and the creation of those financial reporting standards. So.
Yeah, and Gabby, I do agree with that. I'm very much a fan of.
I know we always talk about this.
Not IFRS to the rest of the world. The real question is, can the major economies that have litigation issues deal with a system that has not enough standards? It's too broad. So if the U.S. adopts IFRS, the only way it can adopt it is to add another 3,000 pages of the Quran and the Bible. It would have to add that to clarify it so that you could know what to do. Otherwise, you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So I'm very much a fan, and I agree completely with your point, a very important point, that what IFRS has done is to raise the level of accountability and transparency around the world.
Oh,
it's very, very, very important that it happen. The question is, could the U.S. join it as it's currently promulgated? It'll be tough. We tried to get them to consider adopting a GAAP, and they wouldn't because it was too detailed.
For sure.
And so as a consequence, we would have to sort out how we manage litigation, which is a challenge. But going back to the other issue that you raised, which I think is very important, so where do we go from here with regard to this issue about standards? And we talked about innovation and change that takes place. I think the next several years are going to see a great deal of change, and it's going to be way more accelerated than what you saw in the past because of COVID. COVID, in fact, is going to force to the forefront all sorts of changes that maybe would have taken 5 or 10 years to occur, particularly in terms of communication, education, all the things that we talked about. And so that's going to also drive us to have to develop these standards more quickly and to clean up the markets at the cash level.
Oh, for sure. So we're coming towards the end of our time together. So I just wanted to ask, drawing upon the breadth and depth of your experience in disruption, disintermediation, the insurance industry, sustainability, as well as, Dr. Sandor's role as the father of financial futures, if you could share with us your advice for those of us who are involved and are seeking to develop as a self-regulatory association, as well as those who are finding themselves at the heads of an emerging business and a very emerging industry. What advice could you share as we begin the process and development of this space?
Right. And I think with the development of any self-regulatory association or any industry-style group, the challenge you have is that when you bring competitors together, they all have their own vested interests. We know that. We had several examples of that in the insurance industry where we tried to bring the competitors together to form, as one example, a common computer system so insurance agents could input the data one time and it would go to every company. And it proved to be impossible to accomplish. So if you were to say, what is the key thing that needs to happen? It's to get a sufficient number of the major participants to agree that they would come together and they would set aside their own unique best interests to develop something for the common good. And that's a challenge because you have to bring the regulators together. You have to bring the major participants in the market together, the exchanges, for example. You have to create a system where everybody can say, let's come to a common set of standards that we can all agree to and then implement it in that fashion. So, and that's really the role of what the Global DCA is trying to do. It's trying to bring them together. And so hopefully with the people on this call, you'll be able to consider the importance of that to your own organizations. And it would be great to see participation in this broader effort, which will benefit all. But it's got to be something that gets broad participation or it won't work.
Okay, perfect. And Dr. Sandor, if you could give some closing thoughts about advice or key lessons learned that may be applicable and help some of those who are involved in shepherding this industry.
Sure. I thank you, Gabby. But first of all, let me start again with a bit of an overview, and then I'll drive it down to on ground. We're living in a world where there's only two franchises left. There's speed and flexibility. Nothing else matters within an organization, and anything that you build has to be fast and it has to be flexible. Out of that, follows several lessons that I have learned over the years, and I have a lot of scars to prove it. One of the first lessons is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, okay? Just get something down and do not strive for perfection. Get the principles right,
yeah.
A, and then B, do it fast, okay? Those are both very good. So the good should not be, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. The second thing is, Dennis made a key point. It's hard to do this, but when I call a meeting or when I chaired exchange committees or my own companies with my board of directors, the important thing is not to pretend that anybody doesn't have vested interests. Okay?
Yeah.
The reality is they all come, as Dennis alluded to, their vested interests. So start with the premise that you don't want anybody at the table, okay, who doesn't have a vested interest. You just want a portfolio of vested interests, right?
Yeah.
Pretend that vested interests don't exist, but get as many diverse set of vested interests so you can come to an agreement where the vested interests are together. One of the lessons you learn in writing a futures contract, you're best off if nobody likes it or everybody likes it. Right?
Yeah.
A balanced contract is one where everybody walks out of the room feeling they didn't get exactly what they wanted. Right?
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is very, very critical. And that's how I would approach it. Get together. You've got a group of terrific people. This audience that you've assembled, Gabby, is fantastic.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for allowing me to be part of a dialogue with you. As always, I learn from you. But your audience, you go out and be guided by those simple things. And then the last bit of evidence is get close to the users, okay? That don't design it in isolation, right? So the summary is good versus perfect, okay? Vested interest, a portfolio as opposed to simplicity, and 3, make it customer driven. And if you follow those 3 simple rules, I think you will have an incredibly successful self-regulatory organization.
Thank you both very much, Dennis and Dr. Sandor, for taking the time this afternoon to speak with us and for sharing all of your deep expertise, professional perspectives, and projections for what really needs to happen going forward. So thank you both very, very much.